I woke up to the smell of harsh hospital disinfectant and the steady, urgent beep of a monitor tracking my heartbeat. 3 hours after surgeons repaired my spine following a devastating car accident on my way home from an ICU shift at Barnes Jewish Hospital. The first face I saw was not my husband's worry. It was his signature waiting at the bottom of a stack of legal papers. My name is Paula Vance. I am 31 years old, a chief ICU nurse who built a career on remaining completely calm when everything around me is falling apart. My husband did not ask if I was in pain. He set a manila folder on my bedside tray and said so plainly that it chilled me that he had filed for divorce. He told me he was keeping our estate in Clayton, that he had already moved all my personal belongings into a public storage unit and had paid only 1 month of rent. Then came the words that proved how little he ever actually knew me. He told me that I only made $8,100 a month as a nurse, and that I would never recover financially from this. I did not argue. I did not tell him that my actual annual income from my independent holdings exceeded $750,000. I simply picked up the pen with a steady hand and signed away everything he thought he was taking. If this story moved, you drop a comment and let me know where you are watching from today. Real strength is often quiet, and if you do not want to miss how this unravels, go ahead and subscribe now to keep walking through this journey with me. 3 days after leaving the hospital in a temporary wheelchair, my first destination was not a new apartment, but the gray, sprawling rows of a public storage facility in the freezing industrial outskirts of St. Louis. The bitter Missouri winter wind cut straight through my heavy coat as the cab driver kindly helped unload my folding wheelchair onto the icy asphalt. Standing before that metallic roll-up door felt surreal, knowing that 5 years of a shared life had been callously packed into cardboard boxes and shoved into a damp 6x10 space. My husband, Brock Vance, had paid for exactly 30 days of rent, treating my personal history like a temporary inconvenience he could clear off his accounting ledger. I unlocked the heavy padlock, staring at the chaotic pile of my clothes, photo frames, and childhood keepsakes stacked without an ounce of care. My immediate priority was not saving the furniture or arguing over kitchen appliances, but securing the steel lockbox tucked safely beneath my old nursing textbooks. Inside lay the legal documentation of a life Brock had never bothered to inquire about during our entire marriage. Years ago, my late uncle Glenn Vance, an eccentric software developer who passed away shortly before my wedding, established an irrevocable trust in my name. Uncle Glenn had created a specialized medical billing and patient flow algorithm that eventually became the operational backbone for regional healthcare networks across the Midwest. Along with inheriting 35% of the voting equity in a growing chain of physical rehabilitation centers, the patent royalties from his software generated a steady stream of passive income. That trust deposited slightly over $750,000 into my private brokerage account every single year. It was a substantial fortune, yet I continued working my demanding 40-hour weeks as an ICU nurse because caring for critical patients gave my life purpose beyond mere financial security. I had tried to discuss these holdings with Brock early in our marriage, hoping to plan our long-term financial future together as equal partners. However, every attempt was met with his condescending dismissals as he waved his hand, talked over me, and insisted that he understood real estate, while my modest nursing salary was barely worth calculating. Over time, his arrogance built a wall between us, and I simply stopped trying to explain a truth he was too self-absorbed to hear. Sitting inside the cold taxi on the way back to downtown St. Louis, I pulled out my phone and dialed my private attorney, Herman Hayes, a seasoned estate lawyer who had managed my uncle's legacy for over a decade. I instructed Herman to immediately file our formal response to the divorce petition with the St. Louis County Circuit Court. ensuring that every financial disclosure strictly reflected my independent premarital assets. I also had him revoke the automatic payment authorization tied to my secondary bank account, which Brock had quietly utilized to cover the initial month of storage fees and joint property utilities. By severing that link, Brock's name remained the sole entity responsible for the recurring billing cycles on the contract he had signed. Herman assured me that under Missouri law, assets held within an irrevocable trust established prior to marriage were fully protected from marital division. As the cityscape blurred past the car window, I felt a profound sense of clarity replacing the lingering physical ache in my spine. Brock had walked away, believing he had successfully stripped me of my dignity and financial stability, leaving me with nothing more than a modest monthly pay stub. He had no idea that by rushing to finalize the paperwork and severing our legal ties, he had willingly walked straight out of the protective shadow of a multi-million-dollar safety net he never even knew existed. 2 weeks later, while I was focusing on grueling physical therapy exercises every morning, my phone screen flooded with images of a lavish engagement party in Florida. A mutual acquaintance from our former neighborhood group forwarded several social media posts complete with outrage on my behalf that I had never requested. Brock had flown down to a beachfront luxury resort in Naples alongside his former client and new mistress, Janelle Cross. The photographs captured them clinking champagne glasses under string lights, beaming with the kind of performative happiness designed entirely for an online audience. Janelle made sure to tag every photo with obnoxious captions, boasting about starting her new chapter with a man who truly provided. She even added a passive-aggressive comment calling me a boring, broke nurse who belonged in medical scrubs rather than high society. Sitting on my exercise mat in St. Louis, watching those pictures, I felt a distant hollow sting that quickly transformed into complete emotional detachment. What Janelle failed to comprehend, and what Brock was recklessly ignoring, was that the grand lifestyle he promised her was built upon a fragile foundation of leveraged debt. The primary marital asset Brock fought so aggressively to keep was our sprawling residential property in Clayton. He bragged to his real estate colleagues about securing the house in the settlement, believing he had outsmarted me in a high-stakes negotiation. However, that property was heavily mortgaged, and the housing market correction over the previous year had eroded much of its equity. Brock was actively petitioning our primary lender for a cash-out refinance mortgage to fund his increasingly risky commercial ventures. To qualify for those favorable loan terms, his application relied heavily on our joint credit profile and the high combined household income we had officially documented during our marriage. Brock simply assumed I would quietly sign off on the refinancing paperwork out of habit or sheer exhaustion, just as I had supported his previous business endeavors. He failed to realize that the moment he handed me those divorce papers on my hospital bed, every obligation I held toward his financial welfare was permanently severed. During a private consultation at his downtown office, Herman reviewed the pending loan disclosures that the bank had sent for final signature. My attorney pointed out that Brock's loan officer was still operating under the assumption that my medical income backed the primary mortgage guarantee. Herman smiled with cold, professional precision, noting that Brock had backed himself into a corner by rushing the marital division before securing his new credit lines. We took immediate, decisive action to protect my credit rating and isolate Brock's financial liabilities. Herman drafted a formal, legally binding notification directly to the underwriting department of the lending institution in St. Louis. The document explicitly stated that I had officially initiated divorce proceedings, that I was no longer a resident of the Clayton property, and that I was formally revoking my name, credit score, and financial guarantees from all current and future mortgage applications associated with Brock. By submitting that declaration, we effectively pulled the central pillar out from under his pending refinance application. Brock was left standing on an economic tightrope without a safety net, blissfully unaware in sunny Florida that the very mechanism he intended to use to build his empire was about to trigger an irreversible financial collapse. Exactly 1 month after my attorney Herman Hayes submitted the formal notice revoking my credit guarantees to the banking network, my phone rang relentlessly at 9 o'clock on a Monday evening. I sat in my quiet rental apartment near Barnes Jewish Hospital, nursing a cup of herbal tea while reviewing shift schedules for my ICU unit. The caller ID displayed Brock's name, flashing urgently against the dark screen as he attempted to reach me for the 5th consecutive time. I picked up the line, keeping my breathing steady, and before I could even utter a neutral greeting, his voice exploded through the speaker in a tidal wave of unbridled rage and panic. He skipped any polite pretense, screaming so loudly that his words distorted through the receiver, demanding to know what malicious game I was playing with his financial affairs. The sudden collapse of his commercial ambitions had hit him with brutal force earlier that afternoon during a meeting with his primary lending officer in downtown St. Louis. When the underwriting department processed the formal withdrawal of my credit profile, his pending cash-out refinance application was immediately flagged for high-risk fraud and compliance review. Without my verified healthcare earnings and pristine credit history anchoring the primary mortgage guarantee, his standalone debt-to-income ratio skyrocketed far past the legal lending threshold. The bank promptly canceled the approval for his new business credit line and issued an ultimatum letter giving him exactly 30 days to deposit $450,000 in collateral reserve funds to prevent an immediate default declaration on the Clayton estate. To compound his growing fury, an overdue notice from the public storage facility arrived at the Clayton address that same morning, addressed directly to his name as the primary contract holder. Because I had removed my automatic billing authorization, the recurring rental fee for the storage unit went unpaid once his initial 30-day prepaid period expired. Brock was infuriated to discover that I had not returned to retrieve the bulky furniture or clear out the remaining contents, leaving him legally liable for the penalty fees and impending auction warnings. He railed against me over the phone, accusing me of sabotaging his reputation out of petty bitterness and insisting that I was legally obligated to cover half of the mortgage shortfall as part of our ongoing divorce settlement. Listening to his frantic tirade, I felt no urge to shout back or defend my actions, recognizing that his outrage stemmed entirely from his own short-sighted vanity. He had stood beside my hospital bed weeks earlier, arrogantly declaring that I made a mere nurse's salary and claiming that I would never recover financially from his departure. Now, facing the cold reality of a credit system that refused to bend for his hollow promises, he was desperately begging the very woman he had discarded to step in and salvage his failing balance sheet. I let the silence stretch across the line until his breathless rant finally faltered, allowing the heavy weight of his desperation to hang uncomfortably in the air between us. I spoke calmly into the receiver, making sure my voice carried the immovable weight of a decision made long ago. I reminded him that he had chosen to separate our lives, claim sole ownership of our shared property, and assign a precise dollar value to my worth without ever asking for the truth. I plainly informed him that his mortgage liabilities and storage contracts were entirely his own burden to manage, just as he had so proudly insisted during our last face-to-face encounter. Before he could unleash another barrage of frantic demands, I quietly ended the call, placed the phone face down on the dining table, and returned to my evening routine without giving his panic another second of my thought. On Wednesday morning of the following week, Brock's financial crisis began to spread like an oil spill across his entire business empire. Commercial real estate developers across St. Louis quickly caught wind of his sudden credit downgrade and the formal halt placed on his residential refinancing. In the high-stakes world of property investment, a sudden loss of banking backing is the ultimate red flag, signaling impending insolvency to everyone involved. Brock's primary equity partners for the new suburban shopping mall project immediately held an emergency board meeting to re-examine his financial guarantees. Realizing that his liquidity was virtually non-existent without joint spousal assets, They exercised their contractual emergency clauses, withdrawing millions in capital commitments and leaving Brock solely responsible for the massive unpayable site acquisition costs. While his commercial venture dissolved into chaos, an even more explosive confrontation was brewing inside the walls of the Clayton estate. Janelle had been intercepting certified mail deliveries arriving at the house, including formal default notices from the lender and urgent demands for collateral reserves. Upon opening the formal correspondence, she discovered the terrifying truth that Brock was standing on the absolute brink of personal bankruptcy and mortgage foreclosure. The grand promises of boundless wealth, private jets, and high society galas that he had whispered to her during their whirlwind affair were completely fabricated. Driven by overwhelming panic and betrayal, Janelle confronted Brock the moment he stepped through the front entrance after another disastrous meeting with his legal advisors. The argument quickly escalated into a screaming match that shattered any remaining illusion of romance between them. Janelle hurled bitter insults at him in the grand foyer, calling him a pathetic liar, a hollow fraud, and an insecure boy pretending to be a self-made tycoon. She berated him for dragging her into a sinking ship, demanding to know how a man could present such a polished image while secretly drowning in astronomical debt. Brock tried frantically to defend himself, pleading for time and promising that he could restructure his loans if she just stayed patient. However, Janelle refused to listen, loudly packing her designer suitcases and declaring that she had no intention of wasting her youth on a broke, disgraced broker facing financial ruin. By the time the sun set over St. Louis, the fallout from Brock's deceit had destroyed every pillar of his professional reputation. News of his canceled credit lines, default notices, and abandoned development projects traveled at lightning speed through the close-knit commercial real estate community. Former colleagues who once sought his counsel now refused to answer his phone calls, while institutional clients hurriedly transferred their lucrative listings to competing agencies. Over a decade of painstaking networking, aggressive branding, and calculated social maneuvering vanished in a matter of days, exposing the hollow core of an empire built entirely on borrowed leverage and stolen credibility. Sitting in my apartment, I received a brief text message from a former neighbor detailing the chaotic scene of Janelle storming out of the Clayton driveway with her luggage piled into an expensive rental vehicle. The neighbor mentioned that police had even been called briefly to quiet the domestic disturbance, leaving Brock standing alone on his manicured lawn in total humiliation. I read the message with a quiet sense of closure, feeling neither malice nor triumph, but simply the profound stillness of justice taking its natural course. Brock had constructed a delicate house of cards on a foundation of arrogance and disrespect, and now he was forced to watch it collapse under the weight of his own terrible choices. 2 months later, red foreclosure notices and bank seizure warnings were plastered across the gates of the Clayton estate. The financial institution officially initiated distress auction proceedings on the property, seeking a quick liquidation sale to recover their outstanding debt exposure before market valuations dropped further. Neighbors watched from their porch steps as a massive flatbed tow truck hauled away Brock's luxury sports car directly from his driveway to satisfy defaulted lease obligations. Standing on the sidewalk without his tailored suit or designer watch, Brock could only stare blankly as the enforcement agents drove off with his final status symbol, leaving him utterly stripped of his public persona. As the financial roof collapsed over his head, Janelle wasted no time securing her personal interests and abandoning the crumbling relationship. She officially filed for an expedited legal separation through her private attorney, cutting all ties before his personal liabilities could bleed into her own credit history. Before packing her bags, she thoroughly stripped the master suite of every high-end accessory, designer handbag, and expensive piece of jewelry Brock had purchased for her during their brief whirlwind romance. Leaving behind a quiet house filled with half-packed cardboard boxes and unpaid utility bills, Janelle drove away into the rainy night without offering a single word of comfort or looking back once at the man who had ruined himself to impress her. Completely ruined, abandoned by his associates, and facing imminent eviction from the sheriff's department, Brock spiraled into a state of absolute despair. Late on a cold Friday night, heavily intoxicated and sitting alone in the darkened living room of the foreclosed house, he dialed my number continuously until his call was directed to automated voicemail. The recording lasted over 4 agonizing minutes, capturing the raw, pitiful breakdown of a man whose overbearing ego had finally shattered into pieces. He wept openly into the microphone, his slurred voice trembling as he pleaded for forgiveness, acknowledging for the first time how foolishly he had acted when he threw away our marriage. Between breathless sobs, Brock stammered that he now realized I was the steady foundation that had held his entire life together through every past struggle. He admitted that his blind ambition and arrogance had blinded him to my real worth, begging me to use my family assets to intervene with the mortgage officers and halt the auction. He claimed that if I paid off his immediate default obligations, he would spend the rest of his days proving his loyalty and making amends for how callously he had treated me at the hospital. Listening to his desperate rant, I could hear the background echoes of an empty house that no longer belonged to him, underscoring the absolute magnitude of his downfall. I listened to the entire voicemail recording the next morning while sitting quietly on my apartment balcony with a hot mug of black coffee in my hand. Hearing his broken voice brought no swell of anger or residual heartbreak, only a profound sense of quiet closure that validated every choice I had made since leaving that hospital room. I tapped the screen, deleted the audio message permanently from my phone storage, and blocked his phone number without wasting a single breath on a response. Brock had willingly traded a genuine partnership built on mutual respect for a hollow fantasy of wealth, and now he was left to face the cold consequences of his own undoing. 3 months after his first frantic phone call, I finally agreed to meet Brock one last time at the downtown St. Louis office of Herman Hayes. Walking into the glass conference room, I barely recognized the man sitting across the table, who appeared thoroughly defeated, hollow-eyed, and wearing a rumpled suit that hung loosely on his weakened frame. When Herman laid out my finalized personal financial disclosures, including my verified personal income exceeding $750,000 annually from medical consulting and patented healthcare applications, Brock froze in total disbelief. Realizing that the quiet nurse he had so arrogantly dismissed as a financial burden was actually wildly successful in her own right, he lowered his head, desperately begging for a second chance and pleading for financial assistance to clear his mounting debts. I looked at him with calm detachment, feeling neither anger nor pity, but simply a deep clarity about the journey that had brought us to this table. I plainly informed him that his greatest loss was never the Clayton house, his luxury vehicles, or his prestige in real estate circles, but rather the fact that he had destroyed the only person who had ever loved him without calculation or material expectation. I quietly pushed the signed decree of absolute divorce across the dark oak table, picked up my handbag, and walked out of the room without looking back at his weeping form, forever closing the chapter on our marriage. 8 months later, my physical recovery was complete, and I stood on stage at the annual Missouri Healthcare Gala, receiving a prestigious award for pioneering digital health solutions across regional medical networks. Dressed in an elegant emerald gown and surrounded by distinguished industry leaders, I felt fully restored, grounded, and immensely proud of the quiet resilience that had rebuilt my life from the ashes of betrayal. As the formal evening reception concluded, I walked toward the valet foyer and happened to pass the banquet service crew, clearing leftover glassware in the hallway. Standing among the temporary event logistics staff was Brock, wearing a faded, oversized catering uniform and holding a heavy tray of dirty dishes. His hands were calloused, his hair was graying at the temples, and he looked decades older than the ambitious man who had once tried to erase my existence. Our eyes met briefly across the crowded marble corridor, creating a sharp moment of silence that hung heavily in the air between us. I met his gaze with absolute grace and unshakable pride, while he flushed with burning humiliation, quickly lowering his head to avoid my eyes and stepping back into the shadows of the service doorway. Brock's total downfall serves as an unmistakable reminder that genuine wealth is never measured by hollow posturing luxury brands or borrowed leverage. When a person chooses greed over loyalty and treats a devoted partner as a disposable stepping stone, the universe has a precise way of ensuring that every arrogant choice carries an unavoidable debt. True power lies in self-worth, quiet resilience, and the integrity to rebuild oneself stronger after enduring deep betrayal. Thank you so much to every single listener who followed this journey to the very end. Your time, support, and thoughtful presence mean the absolute world to me. What are your personal thoughts on how Brock's choices ultimately caught up with him, and how would you have handled that final encounter at the gala? Please share your reflections in the comments below.